Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Holmes. I'm Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon. We have a very exciting topic that we're going to be looking into, ballistic missile defense. I was talking to a colleague of mine just a minute ago. There was an excellent panel on energy policy, and he was saying it's going to be a very hard act to follow. But as you will see, we have a film and we also have a general. So we will we'll do our best to make sure that we can live up to the high expectations of our colleagues in domestic policy. Yeah, well, that's right. Sorry, General, I should have listed you first. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about this very important issue, defending America against ballistic missiles. This issue is very timely as the threat grows from Iran, from North Korea, and also from terrorists, and even, as you've seen from watching the news recently, from Russia and from China. Now, Ronald Reagan couldn't have been more right on the need for missile defense. We have the ability to protect ourselves, but for the most part, we still remain vulnerable to attack. And we are, frankly, at a critical juncture in our history. We need to deploy defenses now before it is too late. And that's why we've made missile defense a core element of our Leadership for America initiative, and we call that initiative Protecting America. We've committed people and we've committed resources to this effort because we want to be sure that the United States deploys a comprehensive system of sea-based, space-based, and land-based defenses as soon as possible. And we will keep pressuring the Pentagon and the Congress to protect our access to space and to modernize our nuclear system. Now, the good news is that we've made progress since the lean years of President Clinton and the decades under the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. That treaty had tied our hands, all in the name of a policy aptly named mutual assured destruction. We've had some major successes since then, but we still have a very long way to go, especially after hearing Barack Obama and his advisors say that they want to put their main focus in the missile defense area on testing the missile defense systems. Now, there's nothing wrong about testing, but folks, all too often that has been code for no deployment. They may not get it, but the American people do. Overwhelmingly, the American people want missile defense. But what we need to do is to get President Obama and the Congress to do what the American people demand. Now, to do this, we need to educate the American people, and particularly people, leaders like you in the conservative movement, about what we are capable of doing today and how much more needs to be done. Now, to do just that, we have pulled together a distinguished panel to explore the future of missile defense. First, we have Jim Carafano, the Assistant Director of the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies. Jim is a 25-year Army veteran. He is doing an exceptional job as the project leader for the Protect America initiative, and he'll tell you more about the Missile Defense Project in a moment. We are extremely honored also to have with us General Trey Obering, the director of the Missile Defense Agency at the Pentagon. That's the agency that's mandated by Congress to acquire effective ballistic missile defense systems for our armed forces, but also tasked with developing options for ballistic missile defense for the American homeland. There is simply no one better able to tell us how far we've come and what we still need to do. Joining Jim and General Obering is Baker Spring, our F.M. Kirby Research Fellow in National Security Policy. Many of you remember how instrumental Baker was in getting us out of the ABM Treaty. He argued for that step long before most people realized how restrictive that treaty really was. Now, before I turn things over to the panel, though, I have a treat for you. This is the film I was telling you about. This afternoon, for the first time, we are showing a trailer of the Heritage's very first documentary. What you're about to see is a 7-minute promotional trailer for a new film on the need for missile defense. And we will be rolling this film out in February of next year to the public. Now, our goal is, with this film, is once again to make the call for a comprehensive missile defense system a priority for the conservative movement. Jim will tell you more about the film, but we are very pleased with the quality of the film, and we hope that you will be as well. It's a high-definition documentary that tells the story of the very real threats that we face from hostile nations and also from rogue dictators. It is aptly named 33 Minutes, Protecting America in the New Missile Age, because that's how long it would take for an enemy's ballistic missile to hit the United States. Here is the DVD cover, and we also have a reader that goes along with it that will be available at the time that the film appears. It is a marvelous new medium for us at the Heritage Foundation. It's an exciting project. It's going off into a new direction that we've never done before. Before I show it to you, I would especially like to thank Rebecca Hagelin, our Vice President of Communications and Marketing, and her assistant Becca Coons for their work on this very exciting project. Rebecca's vision to tell this story in film and her leadership and commitment to the project were absolutely key in making it all happen. In addition to shepherding the making of the film, Rebecca has come up with an exciting marketing plan, which includes industry-quality promotional materials and screenings across the entire country. We can't thank her enough and her team for all of her fine efforts. So without further ado, let's roll the clip and see the trailer.
One of the most fundamental roles of government is to protect us from enemies. And right now, we are not protected.
Hope is not a good foundation for a national security strategy. We need to recognize the threats that are out there, and the threat of ballistic missile attack is real.
Americans need to know that we are completely vulnerable to a ballistic missile armed with a nuclear weapon.
The longest times are typically around 30 to 33, 34 minutes. And that would be for a long-range missile that would be fired, for example, from North Korea to the United States or from Iran to the United States.
Less than 33 minutes away, the whole city, their whole life could be annihilated.
That if an enemy of America had a ballistic missile, they could basically use it to hold America hostage. Then someday there'll come in a moment when America wants to go forth in the world and do something good. The enemy's gonna say, if you do that, we're gonna shoot this missile in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco.
It's very difficult to guess the number of states that will have ballistic missiles in 10 years. I mean, if one follows a straight line projection, the number gets quite large. It's the type of state that is acquiring ballistic missiles that is most disturbing.
And we've already seen the transfer of very short-range rockets and missiles from a state to a terrorist organization. When you marry that with a weapon of mass destruction, even one fired into an American or allied city could cause tremendous devastation.
My number one concern today is a terrorist with a nuclear weapon.
Some crazy maniacs to attack us, harm us, and destroy our life.
Biological weapons are mass casualty weapons. They can cause diseases in humans, in animals, and kill them. We should expect not dozens, not hundreds, even not thousands. Probably we should talk about tens or hundreds of thousands of possible casualties.
I'm standing in front of Ground Zero, one of the most devastating attacks in all of U.S. history. So imagine instead of planes, if this had been a nuclear weapon on a ballistic missile and it had detonated just a few thousand feet above our head. Or electromagnetic pulse, a massive push of ionized particles that might incapacitate every electrical system in the United States. Life in America would never be the same.
A ballistic missile defense does provide us with a more effective deterrent against countries like North Korea and Iran.
Americans also should know that they are not alone. They have very good allies. They have them in Europe. If we don't deploy whole missile defense projects, it would mean that we will be held like a hostage. Our negotiating position will be weaker. We could fail. Evil has to be prevented.
We've got to close off all avenues of attack.
It's quite simple and clear to me. If not America, then who?
The myth that missile defense won't work. We've heard that for many, many years, despite the evidence, despite the successes.
Time and time and time again, we've proven the critics wrong. Initially, they said that we would not be able to hit a bullet with a bullet. Well, we've gotten beyond being able to hit a bullet with a bullet. We now are able to hit a spot on a bullet with a bullet. Once the ballistic missile is detected, it alerts ground-based and sea-based radars. They then put their radar beams on the incoming missile. And then basically, we fly the interceptor, what we call the kill vehicle, right into the warhead. The technology has caught up with the vision that President Reagan laid out, frankly, back in 1983.
It's up to us, in our time, to choose and choose wisely between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day.
Many Americans may think that we already have an SDI program because they heard Ronald Reagan and other presidents talk about it. The fact is that we do not have enough capability right now to do what we need to do.
Many countries now have nuclear capability and ballistic missile capability, which would enable them to launch an attack from many thousands of miles away, wiping out an entire city or perhaps even an entire state. It's critical that missile defense be a part of our national arsenal.
The threat of somebody having a ballistic missile, to say, I can push a button, and in less than an hour, your country will never be the same.
Missile defense, as a part of the total defense of our country, is found in the very first paragraph of the Constitution, the preamble.
The Constitution calls for the role of the federal government to give us the common defense. It's one of the most basic things that the federal government should be doing.
The people should demand a commitment from their leaders that they will finish the job. This is a fundamental obligation of the federal government to defend Americans.
I believe that American leadership is essential. It is critical for America to lead. America is, after all, freedom's greatest hope.
So when all else fails, when all the negotiations have broken down, when there is a missile in the air, you have to have the ability to destroy it, because the only other ability that you would have would be to apologize to those that died.
I'm going to give you two really, really good reasons to be really, really, really excited. The first reason is that if you remotely were impressed or engaged by the trailer, the 7-minute version in any way, you are going to be blown away. Poor choice of words. You are going to be blown away by what's in the film, because there is not a tenth of what's in the film in the trailer. There is so much more, and I'm going to tell you just a bit about some of that. But this is really, I think, one of the most dramatic and impressive documentaries you'll ever see in your lifetime. The second reason why you should be very excited is because there is something that you can do, you personally and as an individual, to make the world safer for your children and your grandchildren. And that doesn't happen every day. So why is this important? Well, the answer is really simple. 95% of Americans in a survey. 95, let me be Joe Biden and say that again. 95% of Americans worry about the threat of a ballistic missile attack on the United States. Overwhelmingly, most Americans, and it's bipartisan, want missile defense. Most Americans want missile defense, even if we are in troubled economic time and have trouble funding other things. And here's the problem. Many Americans think we already have missile defense. And few Americans are aware of how ambivalent the Congress and the incoming administration are in actually delivering on the promise of missile defense. Now, that's not bad news. This is an amazing and dramatic opportunity. It's a dramatic opportunity because when Congress hears the will of the American people on this issue, they will act. And this film is going to be the centerpiece of galvanizing the bipartisan support across this country, which already exists, to demand that our government do something about this threat. So let me talk to you for just a couple of minutes about what it's like to make a movie. It's really cool. It really, first of all, the team at Heritage is unbelievably amazing and creative. And I just want to share just 3 things from the film to kind of get you going here. The first, I want to talk just about, there's 3 scenes in the movie, because the one thing that we did when we made this movie is this is a movie that has to speak to Americans. And so we insisted, I mean, you saw some kind of, talking heads there, but we insisted that this be a film that everyone could understand. And so one of the things we try to do is to every way to shape things in a way that an American that doesn't know anything about missile defense or anything other than the fact that they don't want to have their nation threatened would get at. So one of the things we said, how do you describe a missile on the attack in the United States? Because there's nothing in this film that is at 100% real. Every comment has been vetted. Technically, it's completely accurate. Even where we do simulations in the film, the simulations are technically accurate. There's nothing that's dramatized. And so how do you dramatize the effects of an attack on the United States when you can't actually show that? So we had the idea of there's a scene in the film of standing on 9/11, standing at ground zero and saying, this was a terrible day. Actually, if you take the 2 airplanes, that's about a 2-kiloton detonation. But if you made that a nuclear weapon and just made it a 10-kiloton detonation, and in the next scene, you're standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, because that's where you'd be standing and still be a casualty. And looking behind you at the Manhattan skyline, all of that would be aflames and crumbled. And then we said, okay, let's say we had a really clever enemy that decided to put a nuclear weapon and explode it in space and use it as an EMP weapon, that's electromagnetic pulse, and use the power of the nuclear weapon to push downward and overload electrical circuits in the United States. Where would you be a casualty? And you're standing on the beach in California, because there's not a part of the country that wouldn't be touched by that disaster. So then we get into talking about the technical aspects of the film. And what we have is, in every scene where there's a technical issue, the person that answers the question is an average American. Some of them are cowboys, some of them are moms, some of them are nurses, some of them are teachers. But we have to, the thing was, is if an average American on the street can explain this, anybody already done this. So all the technical stuff in the film is actually explained by everyday average Americans. And the last thing I want to tell you about is when you get through with this hour-long film and you get to the end, you are so engrossed that when you hear the call to action, and every good documentary ends in a call to action, and the call to action in this film is incredibly simple. It's make your government do what it said it's going to do, build a missile shield. And when you hear Lady Thatcher say, America must do this, because after all, America is freedom's best hope, let me tell you, your heart will sing with the belief that this can be done and should be done. So I just want to finish up by saying, what can you do? And there's 2 things you can do. Thing number 1, as you exit the auditorium today, you're going to be offered a little package, and it's going to have 2 things in it. One is a trailer of the film. It's exactly what you saw up here. It's 7 minutes long. You can take that with you. And the other is a copy of our reader, which goes along with the film. There's 18 short essays in here written by distinguished people, Charles Krauthammer, Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor, several of the folks here at Heritage, that goes into more details on the key issues. And again, it's explained in everyday language. We want you to take those with you. And here's the other thing you can do. If you think this is an important issue, and you think your neighbors and your friends and the people in your community should know about this, you can sign up now. The film's going to be available in February. The reader we actually have for distribution now. You can sign up now to organize a screening in your community. And you can go to our website, 33minutes.com. And in case you forget it, it's on the back of the reader, and it's also on the back of the trailer. And you can sign up to conduct a screening in your community. You can also sign up to get email alerts to get more information, find out how you can send information to the neighbors and other folks in your community. So you can be a grassroots organizer on building the missile defense shield this country needs. So I'm going to finish with this. This is my challenge to you. I promised Rebecca I wouldn't say I want you to crash the website. So I won't say that. But if after this meeting today, if over the course of the next couple of days, there aren't hundreds of people signing up for screenings, there aren't hundreds of people signing up for email alerts, and you and your friends and your neighbors, demanding that the nation hear on this issue, then we have failed. And so the burden is now on you. Make sure you pick up your packet on the way out and get to business of saving the future of this country. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to General Obering.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be here. As was mentioned, one of the best things that we try to do is educate folks so that they have the information that they need to make the right decisions. And hopefully, after our little talk today, you'll have information that you did not have before. As any good Air Force officer, we always talk through charts, and I have a couple that I would like to do so with you today. First of all, if I could have the first chart, just a little background, as was already alluded to. The world has changed. When President Reagan launched the Strategic Defense Initiative program, it was at the height of the Cold War, a bipolar world that we no longer inhabit. It is a much more dangerous world. And yet, at the time in 2001, we had an anti-ballistic missile treaty that was restricting our hands and preventing us from moving forward. That's gone, and that's thanks to President Bush and his administration. As I said, it's a much more dangerous world. We no longer have just a single threat. We have multiple actors, and as the access to these weapons has grown, it is much more likely that you're going to see these in the hands of non-state actors. We've seen that already with Iran and Syria passing short-range and missiles and rockets to organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas in Israel. And so the access to these weapons have severely grown. Countries like Iran and North Korea are not only accelerating the development of these weapons themselves, but they are proliferating these to other countries, as I mentioned. We also have seen where missile defense has actually stabilized events in a crisis. In July of 2006, when the North Koreans very aggressively stacked a long-range missile, did not tell anybody what was on top, and fired several other shorter-range missiles, we were able to rely on the missile defense system that we had in place to be able to protect the United States from that single missile, that single shot. And it actually was able to stabilize because there were some former Clinton administration officials that were advocating that we actually preemptively strike the site, which we think would have been very escalatory. And so we do need missile defense to meet a host of challenges in an uncertain future. And maybe during the Q&A, I'll talk to you about the satellite shoot-down that we did this year. And that was something that was totally unforeseen that we were called upon to act on. Next slide. If we look at strategic overview very, very carefully, ballistic missiles are becoming the air force of choice for many nations. They are bypassing conventional aircraft and going directly to ballistic missiles. And the reason is very simple. They know they can never equal the United States or our Western allies in a traditional air force. They also know that historically there's been no defense against these ballistic missiles, and so that's why they're investing heavily in them. And I think that we have very much of an arms control flavor to what we're doing, and I'll talk about that later as well. I've already talked about Iran and North Korea having their own programs. They are collaborating very closely together too, by the way. And that's why it's hard to judge about the progress that each one is making. But they have taken the old Soviet Scud technology, we call it, that were built for shorter range missiles, and they've been able to go to increasing ranges in their missile development to where now North Korea has the ability to reach the United States with a long-range missile. They tried to fly that in July of 2006, as I said. The Iranians are right on their heels. They're developing longer and longer range weapons. They have already tried twice this year to fire a 2,000-kilometer missile. Now, keep in mind that Iran, to be able to cover all of Israel and all of the U.S. bases in the region, they would only need about a 1,300-kilometer missile. So why a 2,000-kilometer? Why a 3,000 or 4,000-kilometer missile? That's what has us worried and why we're very much concerned. We have, in fact, today, fielded an initial capability that is up and around the clock 24/7. We have warfighters manning the consoles. They're under the integrated control of the combat commanders. We have that today, but we are very far from finished, and we have a long, long way to go. And we do have confidence in our missile defense system, and I think hopefully I'll show you why we have that confidence. And I'm often asked in my 4.5 years as director of the agency now, what was my biggest surprise? And it has to be international. It just totally surprised me. We have exploded in our international cooperation, and a lot of that is because they see the same things we do in terms of the proliferation and the threats from these missiles. Next slide. Now, we've taken a very systematic approach to this. This chart, a version of this, was actually briefed to President Bush back in 2003 at Crawford. And we talked about what is the strategy we wanted to pursue. We're very much concerned initially with the protection of the homeland versus the North Korean threat, and that's why we moved quickly in our first block to be able to establish that capability. We also wanted to be able to expand that coverage to our allies and friends in one specific region, and then turn our attention to protecting the United States homeland from Iran, expanding that to our European theater and our partners. Why? Well, several reasons. Number one, we have a significant number of deployed forces in the European theater, and also to protect our allies and our bases there as well. And then finally, to be able to protect more than just one region in both, for example, the Pacific as well as the European regions. Next slide. Now, this is our program of record today. This will continue to evolve. It will continue to improve, hopefully, as long as the national will is there. For any missile, whether it's a very short-range rocket that has rained on Israel, for example, as many as 100 a day last year, to an ICBM or intercontinental ballistic missile, they fly through 3 distinct phases. There's a boosting phase, a mid-course or coasting phase, and then a terminal phase. And what we're doing are building defenses in each one of these phases. Now, we have 2 boost phase defense programs, an airborne laser and our kinetic energy interceptor weapon. I will tell you that we're still about 8 to 10 years away from making those operational. However, we have made absolutely incredible progress with the airborne laser, especially. We've now demonstrated everything that we need to demonstrate to shoot down a boosting missile with a beam of light in the boosting phase, and we plan to do that next summer. We've already demonstrated, we've already fired the laser more than 70 times on a 747 fuselage at Edwards, and we have flown the heavily modified 747 with the other tracking laser and atmospheric compensation laser on there. So we've demonstrated all the technical steps now to shoot down a boosting missile in the boost phase. In terms of mid-course, what we have deployed today is our ground-based mid-course system, which is there. That is the silo-based interceptor. That is the only long-range defense that we have today. And you'll see what the numbers that we have deployed. And we have our Aegis sea-based system that can handle shorter range threats, the medium range down to the very short range threats, to be able to augment that as well. In addition, we have a terminal defense program that is started with the Patriot, the PAC-3 capability that was combat proven, by the way, in Iraqi freedom. A lot of people don't realize this, but there were 9 Iraqi missiles fired at our troops, at coalition troops, and in populated areas during Iraqi freedom. All 9 of those were destroyed by the Patriot system. Very, very effective in combat. In addition, we have a terminal altitude area defense, or THAAD program, that operates just inside and just outside the atmosphere. Again, it is complementary to the other components within this system. All of these interceptors are supported by a family of sensors that you see across the top of the chart. That includes the modification of existing radars, like in Shemya, Alaska, in Beale in California, in Fylingdales, United Kingdom, as well as the building and deployment of more transportable radars, like we have in Japan, for example, today, along with very powerful sea-based capabilities. We have built a sea-based X-band radar that's shown at the top, the third picture from the left. This radar is so powerful, and it's in the sea today in the Pacific. It's been at sea for almost 2 years now, going through its checkout and its testing, that if we put this radar in the Chesapeake Bay, we can track and detect a baseball-sized object over San Francisco. That's the kind of capabilities that we're rolling out, and that's what we are getting for the investment in missile defense today. And of course, all of that supported by a command and control and battle management system that allows all of the combatant commanders the same information, the same situation awareness that they can fight this system in an integrated fashion. Next slide. So here's what we have today. We have deployed a radar to Shiriki, Japan to deal with the North Korean threat. We have modified the radar at Obering in Alaska and Beale in California. And as I said, we have the very powerful sea-based X-band radar that currently is about 100 miles east of Hawaii. We also have deployed 21 and placed 21 interceptors in Alaska and 3 in California. By 2013, we should have 44 of those, 40 in Alaska and 4 in California. We also have produced 18 Aegis ships, and we have developed and deployed about 33 interceptors on those ships. By the end of 2013, we should have more than 130 of those, if not more. And we also have 29 of the shorter Standard Missile 2, which is just a terminal sea-based protection. And by 2013, we should have almost 100 of those. In terms of Iran, we have currently modified the Fallingdales radar in the United Kingdom, and we've tested that and plugged it into the system. But we have to complete the work at Thule radar in Greenland to be able to provide full protection for the United States from the Iranian threat. And in addition, we've been rolling out, or will roll out shortly next year, our Terminal Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD program, with 4 fire units and about 100 of those interceptors. Overall, we've just begun in terms of this capability, but we're going to have continued support to be able to roll out what we need for the future. Next slide. Now, what about our testing? One thing I want to make sure you understand, we do not use warheads on these missiles, on these interceptors. There is no explosive. We actually run the sensor into the incoming target. We are able to do this within inches. And how do we know that? Well, we actually put a fiber optic coating on our target warheads. And as soon as the first fiber breaks, we burst transmit the data to the ground. So we know exactly which fiber came apart in what manner. And that allows us to understand how we destroy these warheads. And we are hitting within inches of where we're aiming now. And that's after flying thousands of miles, hundreds of miles in altitude and thousands of miles downrange as we do these intercepts. We are now 36 of 45 successful, what we call hit-to-kill intercepts since 2001. And that's in our sea-based and our land-based, both our mobile and our silo-based programs. In our testing, we use operationally realistic, we actually use operational sensors, operationally realistic interceptors and software. We have the warfighters participating in very real-world scenarios. We have unannounced target launches with very realistic trajectories, velocities, altitudes of intercept, et cetera. We also are using targets that we believe are as representative as they can be of what we are facing, what we think we face from Iran and from North Korea. And we do end-to-end testing that is consistent with range safety. If we have just 1 minute, I'd like to show you one of those intercept. If you could click on the GMD portion here. This is one that we did in September of 2007. Now, this was to emulate an attack from North Korea to Dallas, Texas, with an intercept from Alaska. In this case, we launched the target from Kodiak Island, Alaska, and we launched the interceptor from California. So we're trying to emulate the geometries. About a 24-minute time of flight for this target, and about a 380-second time of flight for the interceptor. This is a camera that was mounted on the aft of the target. We use this for data collection purposes, making sure we understand the target performance, et cetera. Now, in this particular case, we had a threat-realistic target. We fired an operational interceptor, configured interceptor, from an operational site in Vandenberg, California. We had soldiers manning the consoles in Colorado Springs controlling this. We used an operational radar at Beale, California for this intercept. So the next shot, you're going to see the interceptor launch from Vandenberg. Now, this is our 3-stage interceptor. It's the largest one we have. This is about 60 feet long, about 54 inches wide. The clamshell doors open there and the egress of the interceptor. Now, for the Polish proposal that we have, we're proposing to take the 3rd stage off of this interceptor and just have 2 stages because that allows us to get into the European battle space quicker. Here's the flyout of the interceptor, and I think you're going to see the staging here of the 1st stage. Now, from a very high-flying Gulfstream aircraft, we have very sensitive infrared cameras. So we're looking at hundreds of kilometers in space, and you're going to see the intercept of the warhead by what we call the kill vehicle. This is pure kinetic energy that destroys that warhead. Now you're going to see it in slow motion. then you're going to see something very interesting. You're going to see exactly what the kill vehicle saw. So you're going to see what the kill vehicle is seeing as it's closing in on its target. You're going to see 3 boxes come up, and each box is one of the sensors on the kill vehicle. You're going to see little white boxes inside. Those are targets that it is tracking, objects that it is tracking. It has to go through and understand what's the warhead and what could be a piece of debris or the third stage or whatever. And as you'll see in the 2 left boxes, the warhead comes up right before we hit. So when people say we have no capability against decoys, they're wrong. We have capability against decoys and countermeasures. We cannot handle very complex ones. We will, hopefully, in the future. That's what we have our programs laid out to be able to go do. Next slide, please. Key development areas for the future. We're going to have pervasive sensor coverage. We want to be able to go to space with our sensors so that we can have birth-to-death tracking of these missiles. That allows us to be able to understand the threat suites and be able to handle those more complex threats. We want to have advanced discrimination capabilities to handle the more complex threat suites. We're going to be able to destroy more than one object with each individual interceptor in our multiple kill vehicle program. And of course, we want to be able to move into very, very short-range rocket coverage. And we have a program with Israel to be able to do that. Next slide. I mentioned our international partners. We've more than doubled since 2004. We now have more than 22 countries that we have some cooperation with. Some we are co-developing interceptors, like with Japan. We're developing the next generation of our sea-based interceptors. And others, like the Ukraine, we have actual research and development efforts going on with some of the Ukrainian Space Agency organizations. And last slide, please. Too often times, missile defense is painted as a contrary to arms control, that it somehow is in conflict with that. I believe that in spite of our best arms control measures, both positive, negative sanctions, et cetera, we've continued to see the proliferation of these missiles. Why? It's because we haven't affected the value of them. Because unless we have fielded effective missile defenses, these missiles are very valuable to these countries, and they're going to invest in them. So if we put out effective missile defenses, working with NATO, with other partners around the globe, you'll begin to devalue these missiles in the eyes of some of these countries, and I think you will have an effect on their proliferation. We also know that it bolsters deterrence with respect to making it uncertain on an attacker's part what part of the attack is going to be successful and what's not. We know it's influenced nations not to develop their own nuclear weapons. If they can rely on an effective missile defense capability, that strengthens that conviction that they can rely on that. In addition, as I said, in July of 2006, it provided options to the president other than preemption or retaliation after the fact. And again, that has a stabilizing effect in events in a crisis. And finally, as I said in the film, when all else fails, the only option you have, if you have a target inbound, is to be able to take it out and destroy it. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to questions later.
I'm Baker Spring, FM Kirby Research Fellow in National Security Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. And first of all, I want to thank you. We have made tremendous progress, particularly on the policy front as it relates to missile defense. There was a time when there was a consensus in this town that not only was missile defense not achievable, it was actually undermining the national security policy of the United States, which was then dependent on nuclear retaliation threats as the fundamental bedrock. We have in place now a near consensus that the United States, as it relates to the ballistic missile threat, will be defended, and it's because of the effort that you've put into this that we are at the position that we are now. My purpose here is to give you some idea about where we are now after the results of the election regarding the missile defense issue, which admittedly is mixed, but it is not going to be there's not going to be a dramatic falling back, I think, from the path that we're on now as a country to providing for that defense. Quote unquote from President-elect Obama during the campaign, "In a world with nuclear weapons, America must continue efforts to defend against the mass destruction of its citizens and our allies." If that's not a repudiation of mutually assured destruction, I don't know what is. Now, the problem, of course, is you get down to the programmatic level. And as you might imagine, with all the policy progress that we've made, It's now turning to the question of the programmatics, is that there is some confusion, both in President-elect Obama's positions on these issues and in the Democratic Congress. First of all, with regard to effectiveness, there is an assertion that missile defense systems that we are developing now in the Bush administration are not going to be effective. General Obering has spoken to those issues. It is not a perfect system, and it will never be perfect, but it is making considerable progress, and it is not to be criticized that the policy is ahead of the programmatics. That's a natural tendency anytime you have the kind of dramatic shift that we're talking about today. They're also talking about more rigorous testing, and nobody is going to be opposed to that as long as it's going to the end of expediting an improved missile defense capability. But it also must be understood that if you want more rigorous testing, fine, but you're going to have to pay for that. So you can't reduce the budget on the one hand and say that you want more rigorous testing on the other. If you want more rigorous testing, and certainly I think that that's warranted, then you need to put the money up for it. The final thing is they've talked about the relationship of the United States internationally under this system and the need for cooperation with our allies and friends around the world. And General Obering spoke to that too. There's been dramatic increase in that, and I don't think that President-elect Obama's team has appreciated how extensive it is thoroughly. Let's turn to Congress a little bit. When 2 years ago there was the switch in party allegiance in both houses of Congress, there may have been an assumption that missile defense was quote-unquote finished. Clearly not the case. There has been some reductions. In this year's defense bills, it was roughly a 5% funding reduction. Not good. I would prefer that it had been fully funded, but it was not the kind of disaster that you could have imagined, that they were taking really large percentage cuts, a third or a half out of the missile defense program. So we need to do some educating with regard to the funding issues, but I don't think that we're starting in a bad position. The next issue is the question of balance in the program. It seems like the incoming the next Democratic Congress is going to want to focus more on so-called near-term capabilities and a little bit less on the more exotic ones, particularly the boost phase systems and space-based systems. I'm not going to come back to space. There still needs to be balance in the program. You're going to have both the near-term ground-based mid-course defense and the Aegis systems and that kind of thing. And by the way, I think that even the Democratic Congress likes sea-based systems so much, which we pioneered at Heritage, that they might receive some funding increases. They did this year's bills. So that we're still going to need to have balance in there, but that's something I think that we can work to educate Congress on. The next is the question of the Missile Defense Agency and its relationship with the services that will actually be operating these systems. And in that particular case, I think there is going to be some growing pressure in Congress to move more of these responsibilities from the Missile Defense Agency to the services. In some instances, I think that that's warranted. We've done a lot with Patriot, for example, with the Army. I think we will do more with regard to moving the sea-based systems to the Navy. But there's one thing that must cut across the services, and that is that you have to make sure that the overall command and control system for the global system is integrated across the services, and only an OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense agency, can really do that ultimate integration and perform that responsibility. The tough ideological issue is the question of the misnamed advocacy for preventing the weaponization of space. Well, space has long since been weaponized. So in reality, it's not really an issue, but it does motivate people in the arms control community. And taking missile defense to space is something that we're going to have to think very seriously about. And there's two ways to go about that. You can grow the missile defense program into space, or you can start with a space program with regard to generalized space security. And when you see things like the China anti-satellite test, we may need to look at it from that end and then think about building our space programs towards missile defense or doing some combination of both. Arms control. There's one thing I'm very confident about, and that is that we are not going to go back to the anti-ballistic missile treaty that President Bush withdrew from in the early part of his presidency. If for no other reason, if somebody had the idea to do that, they would have to come back with a treaty that would merit 2/3 Senate support. And I don't think that that kind of support in the Senate is there for a return to that position. Finally, there's one entity out there that could have a significant impact on this debate in just the coming weeks. Congress has established a Strategic Posture Commission to look at both offensive and defensive elements of our overall strategic posture, conventional and nuclear. That commission has a very tough task in terms of coming up with a consensus position about what the relationship of offensive and defensive and conventional and nuclear arms will be in a prudent strategic posture for the United States. But if they do arrive at a consensus position, it may serve to further both the nuclear and offensive elements of our strategic posture as well as the conventional and defensive ones. And we are working with members of the Commission on their very important undertaking. In conclusion, I'd say that the missile defense issue, I think, will continue to move forward. That does not mean that there will not be some criticisms of the program. Some of them could be very effective in the future, but I'm actually pretty optimistic about the program. In fact, if you were to ask me, say, 5 or 10 years ago, whether I was more concerned about the future of our missile defense program or our nuclear deterrent, the future of our nuclear deterrent, I would have said I'd be more concerned about the future of our missile defense program. Today, I think I'm actually on the opposite side marginally. I'm at least as much concerned about the future of our nuclear deterrent than I am about our missile defense program. And that, in and of itself, should say that there's a sea change from the kind of strategic posture that we were pursuing during the Cold War. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Baker, thank you very much. General, thank you. Jim, thank you very much. We have some time for some questions from the floor. We have people standing on both sides of the aisles with microphones, so if you could just raise your hand and I'll recognize you. Who would like to go first? Right here.
Thank you. A question for the General. In what I see in your presentation, it looks like the West Coast is pretty much defended from a threat from North Korea. We have Europe protected from Iran. But what I've been reading also lately is that Iran has been looking at EMP technology exploding in the air and also developing some kind of sea launch capability. What kind of protection do we have for the East Coast from the Atlantic Ocean and also from the Caribbean or South America?
Well, first of all, the interceptors, for example, in Alaska, cover all the United States as well as California. So we actually can engage with a missile coming from Iran from either Alaska or California to protect all the United States, including the East Coast. If you're referring to something like a shorter range missile launched from a ship, that's more problematic. Now, what capabilities do we have to be able to do that? The protections could be provided by Patriot. They could be provided by THAAD, and they could be provided by Aegis. It would be a matter of how we station those or deploy those elements along the most likely targets. It's not our job to do that in terms of missile defense. That's something that's done by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and by the military departments. But it's a very viable protection that we could provide because we have enough units to be able to do that, depending on which metropolitan areas that you want to protect.
Right in the middle, right here.
Sorry, I can talk loud. I just wanted to ask Jim. I know you're saying that we can host screenings and stuff like that, but is there something beyond that with the website and what you guys are doing, so that, say, I watch the video or even just watch the clip, I can go in there and start shooting off letters to representatives, or basically start shooting off notes to letters to the editor, things of that nature? What kinds of things can we do? Does that can that go through Heritage, or because it's not a lobbying agency, do we have to actually, as a group, kind of start putting together our own sites beyond that?
Well, I mean, you can do what you do on so many issues. Heritage provides information, and information is power. So, for example, if you go to the website right now, you'll find a dozen different articles that explain all these different issues in language that we Americans can understand. I'm Baker's test guy. See, Baker comes and explains it to me, and if I understand what he's talking about,
then he comes to me and then I interpret for him.
Then we're good for America because I went to most of I went to West Point, right? You graduate from West Point, you get a Bachelor of Science degree. Okay, it's a piece of paper. I am anyway, but it's really important that we provide you information that you understand that you can use. And that's what the website does. That's what the film's going to do. That's what the email alerts are going to do. So you will have plenty of information to empower yourself. And this is what's really, really important. I mean, if you take nothing else away from what we started today, what the general talked about is here we are on the cusp of having real capability to defend all of our country from any madman in the world. A real-life capability that's tantalizingly just sitting there waiting to happen. And here you have a Congress, as Baker said, which has come a long way since the Reagan days. I mean, nobody calls it Star Wars anymore. Remember, they called it Star Wars to make fun of it because it was science fiction. Nobody says it's not real science anymore. But these guys are sitting on the fence. They'll do the minimum they can get away with to placate the American people. But if we want them to get it over the goal line, we're going to have to put the pressure to do that. So all we're doing is giving you the information. Saving the future, that's your job, not mine.
Right over here.
General, thanks. Y'all done a great job. The only discussion I've heard that may be an issue in the media and the apoplexy of the American public is whether or not the Russians like this. Now, we've made the case that Russia, you have nothing to worry about. This is pure defense. Explain to me, as if you were trying to convince me, that we are right.
Well, first of all, I will tell you that when we pulled out of the ABM treaty, we did not hear anything from the Russians. When we began our deployments in Alaska in the summer of 2004, we heard nothing from the Russians. When we initially were formulating our strategy for expansion into Europe, I actually had a discussion with my counterpart in Russia in my office here in Washington, and I explained to him what we were doing, and he said, well, we may have some concerns about that, but not a very strong reaction. It was not until we named Poland and the Czech Republic that we had a dramatic turn in the Russian reaction. I was at the 2+2 discussions in Moscow last year with Secretaries Rice and Gates. I met with my Russian counterparts along with their equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I'll boil it down to this. They initially presented very technical arguments about, well, you are changing the strategic balance between the United States and Russia by deploying these interceptors at Poland. You're going to be able to see into Russian airspace with the radar of the Czech Republic. And we very calmly went through, I personally briefed the NATO Council and the NATO-Russia Council about 4 or 5 times, and we just systematically showed how that was not true. That first of all, we couldn't even catch a Russian missile fired from Russia toward the United States with an interceptor in Poland. That when you take a look at the radar beam of the radar, by the time it's over Russian territory, it's almost 250 kilometers in altitude. It can't go any below, cannot go below that. So we just kind of systematically removed those. And just the numbers, 10 interceptors in Poland versus hundreds of Russian missiles and thousands of warheads. They know it's not a technical challenge to them. They understand that. This is geopolitical. This is messing in what they consider to be their backyard, even though the Czech Republic and Poland are members of NATO. And that's something that is even more overarching than us deploying missile defense components or elements there. And as we've told the Russians, it is not them we're concerned about. By the way, Russia has a missile defense system. It's been employed and deployed for years. No, they have one. They have deployed missile defense elements. It's been in place for years and years. They have their protection against what could be an Iranian threat to their most populated areas. So they're kind of sitting from a different perspective, aren't they? So anyway, we're going to continue talking with the Russians. We've made some very concrete proposals to them that we think will mitigate their concerns. So we'll see what happens.
Let's go back here.
I've been coming down here for quite a few years, and I want to say that this film we saw is one of the more exciting things in a negative way that I've seen from Heritage. But why in the hell didn't you have it before the election? I think, seriously, you gave us a challenge. I think if we get this in front of the American people through these neighborhood things, if we could have done that, we'd had a different election. I'm convinced of that, because this subject just didn't get any kind of exposure. Secondly, and I defer respectfully to the knowledge at the Heritage, but I think there's a little naivete. As long as the enemies of this country include Barney Frank, I think there's some optimism there that is not overly comforting. Here's a guy that wants to cut the defense budget 25%. Now, we damn well better figure out what we're going to do about guys like that.
I mean, thank you. Do we have anybody over here? I just want to make sure I'm getting everybody spreading out. Okay, right here.
Sir, would you tell us about shooting down the satellite?
Pardon me?
Shooting down the satellite.
Oh, shooting down the satellite. Okay, very, very briefly. About a week before Christmas last year, I was called by one of the senior intelligence community officials, and he described the out-of-control satellite that we had a problem with. It was not only out of control, but it was totally out of communication. So they had no communication with the satellite. And the big concern, their experts and NASA experts all agreed that there was a very highly toxic fuel tank that was full of hydrazine fuel that was going to survive reentry. And they wanted to know, was there something we could do about it? So I put together a small team, and they took a look at both our land-based, our solid-based interceptors, our THAAD mobile interceptors, of which we have several in Hawaii that we use with testing, as well as the sea-based. And we came to the conclusion that we could have shot down the satellite with any of those. We had to modify those to do that, but we could have done it with any of the components. I recommended up the chain to the president that we use the sea-based for 3 reasons. Number one, that missile, that interceptor, is the simplest one that we have, so it was the easiest to modify with respect to the kill vehicle. Number two, it was the least impact overall to our program, frankly, because of where we were headed in the future with our testing and everything. And number three, it gave us more options than just 1 or 2 orbital traces to be able to control the debris from that. And so that's why we recommended Aegis. They accepted that. We went into the analysis and began. In about 6 weeks' time, we modified the interceptor, we modified the ship, and we modified some radars to be able to do this. Now, one important thing here that people don't realize, the ship could not do it by itself. By the time the ship's radar would have picked up the satellite and fired the interceptor, it would have been in a tail chase with the satellite. It would never have caught it. And so we actually had to open up the fire control system of the ship and import off-board information from land-based radars as we tracked the satellite across the United States. So we had radars in Massachusetts, in White Sands, New Mexico, in California, and even Hawaii that were tracking as it came across, and we were updating that information in the ship's fire control system. The ship actually launched the interceptor a long time before the radar ever saw it, its own radar. Now, the lesson learned for missile defense is this integration of different sensors into these different systems can dramatically expand your detection and engagement areas. So you can double or triple the area of a defended area that a ship can provide if you tie it to a very powerful land-based radar. And there's scenarios that's easily, you can envision one in defense of Japan, defense of Israel, et cetera.
If I can make one quick point about this, too, as we look at it historically, is some arms control advocates will say that the intercept of the satellite by the United States and that Aegis ship has essentially no different than the Chinese anti-satellite test of a year or so prior to that. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is no moral equivalency between what the United States did and what the Chinese did. The Chinese were pursuing an aggressive asymmetric anti-space attack, or a simulation of that kind of attack, and we were trying to defend the lives of people on the ground from highly toxic fuel tank that was on that satellite. There is no equivalency.
And if I could back that up, the Chinese actually engaged about 800 kilometers in altitude. That sprayed a lot of debris in orbit that'll be there for years. We were in a constant trade-off between because as the satellite was coming in, it was speeding up. And there was a point where it would be too fast, we couldn't even engage it with off-board radars. And so we wanted to get it as low as possible to minimize the debris, but we needed to have it high enough so that it would be slow enough for us to be able to hit it. And to back up your point, Baker, we went to great lengths to try to minimize that debris to where now all of the debris from our intercept has re-entered totally.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come a long ways since Ronald Reagan's speech in the 1980s on SDI. Yes, the events of last week raised a lot of questions about what's going to happen in the future, but we want to leave you with the hope that since we have come a long way, we've come such a long way that we don't think it is as easy as it was back then to reverse things. My first job at the Heritage Foundation was Baker's job. In 1985, I was the SDI guy. This was the time when Teddy Kennedy was calling it Star Wars, and the Soviet Union took missile defense a lot more seriously than Teddy Kennedy ever did. And it's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union came to an end, because of the SDI program. I just want to emphasize that we've come a long ways. Even though many of our liberal friends like to make war on reality, this is one reality that they're having a great difficult time of having victory against, because the reality of the situation is such that because of the progress that's been made by General Obering and his colleagues at the Department of Defense in the last years, it's just really increasingly difficult to reverse this. Now, this does not mean that we must remain vigilant. We must move forward. We must maintain a strong position against those who want to not only reverse the program, but don't want to give it what's necessary to make it go forward. And that's why Heritage is where it is. That's why we're having this panel today. That's why we made that movie. And that's why we're making the appeal to all of you. So thank you very much for coming. We look forward to seeing you all later.